The first warning came at dawn, when the station's alarms screamed to life, and red lights painted every corridor in the color of blood. Commander Silas Wren stood at the observation deck and watched the darkness of space tear open as ship after ship emerged from hyperspace, and his four hearts stopped beating for just a moment when he recognized the black hulls and the jagged designs that had haunted his nightmares for 30 years. The Vorath had come. How many ships, he asked, though his voice came out as barely a whisper. His tactical officer, a Morthene female with silver scales and trembling hands, counted the signatures on her screen before looking up with eyes full of despair. 47 warships, Commander, and the flagship belongs to Khazul the Undying himself. Silas felt the weight of those words crush his spirit like a physical force, because everyone in the galaxy knew that name, and everyone knew what it meant. Lost a battle in 400 years of conquest, and his Vorath dominion had swallowed entire civilizations the way a flame swallows dry wood. Kithara Station was a small outpost on the edge of Coalition space, home to 12,000 souls from a dozen different species who had come here seeking safety and peace, and now death had found them in the cold void between stars. "Send a distress signal to Coalition Command," Silas ordered as he turned away from the window and the terrible sight beyond it. "Already done, Commander, but the nearest fleet is 3 days away." 3 days might as well have been 3 centuries, because the Vorath would tear through the station's defenses in hours, maybe less. Silas was a Telvari, a species known throughout the galaxy for their forearms and their warrior traditions that stretched back 10,000 years, and he had trained his whole life for moments like this, but nothing had prepared him for the cold certainty of death that now wrapped around his soul. He looked at his soldiers gathered in the command center, a mix of Telvari warriors and Morthene tacticians, and a small group of humans from Earth's young space program, and he saw the same fear in all their eyes. The humans were the newest members of the Coalition, having only discovered faster-than-light travel a mere 50 years ago, and most species still viewed them as primitive newcomers from a dangerous and hostile world called Earth. But they stood alongside the others now, ready to fight and ready to die. "We cannot win this battle," Silas announced to his troops, "but we can buy time for the civilians to reach the escape pods, so that is what we will do." A young human soldier raised his hand and spoke with a voice that shook only slightly. "Sir, there aren't enough pods for everyone, and the Vorath will shoot down any ship that tries to leave." Silas knew this was true, but he could not say it out loud, because hope was the only weapon they had left. "We fight anyway," he said, "because that is who we are." Deep in the lower levels of the station, far from the command center and the soldiers preparing for their last stand, a 17-year-old girl named Mira Chen huddled in a shelter with hundreds of other refugees. She was small for her age, with dark hair that fell across her face and brown eyes that had seen too much sadness in her short life. And she had been traveling to meet her father at a research station when the evacuation order came. Her father was a scientist studying alien ecosystems on a distant moon, and Mira had not seen him in 2 years because space travel was expensive and her family was not wealthy. Now she might never see him again. The shelter was packed with beings of all shapes and sizes, some with scales and some with fur, and some with skin and colors that did not exist on Earth, and they all shared the same expression of terror as the station shook from orbital bombardment. A small creature that looked like a cross between a cat and a bird pressed against Mira's leg, making soft whimpering sounds, and she reached down to stroke its fur, because comfort was all she could offer. "What's happening?" asked a Telvari child with wide golden eyes who sat beside her. Mira did not want to answer because the truth was too terrible, but she could not lie to a child. "Bad people are attacking the station," she said softly, "but the soldiers will protect us." She wished she believed her own words. The bombardment stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the explosions, because it meant the Vorath had finished softening their target and were ready to board. Mira heard screams in the distance, and the sound of weapons fire that grew closer with each passing minute. And she held the alien child's hand and prayed to whatever gods might be. The shelter doors exploded inward, and Mira saw her first Vorath up close. They were nightmares given form, standing 8 feet tall with bodies covered in black chitin armor that grew from their own flesh, and their faces were masses of mandibles and compound eyes that reflected no light and showed no mercy. One of them pointed at the refugees and made a clicking sound that somehow translated through the station systems into words that everyone could understand. Gather the prey and bring them to the central hub for processing. Processing meant death, and everyone knew it. The Vorath soldiers moved through the shelter with brutal efficiency, grabbing refugees and throwing them toward the door, and anyone who resisted was cut down where they stood. Mira watched a Morthene elder try to shield his grandchildren, and saw a Vorath blade open him from shoulder to hip, and she felt something cold and hard settle into her stomach. Was not a battle anymore. This was a harvest. She was grabbed by rough claws and shoved into a line of prisoners, and she walked with hundreds of others through corridors filled with bodies and the smell of blood. And she kept her eyes forward, because looking at the dead would break something inside her that she might need later. The central hub was a vast open space that normally served as a marketplace where species from across the galaxy traded goods and stories, but now it had become a killing floor. Thousands of refugees knelt on the ground with their hands on their heads, and Vorath executioners walked among them with blades drawn and ready. Commander Silas Vren lay among the bodies of his soldiers, a blade wound in his chest that bubbled with each shallow breath, and he watched helplessly as everything he had sworn to protect was taken from him. On a raised platform at the center of the hub, a massive Vorath sat upon a throne made from the bones of conquered species, and his presence radiated power and cruelty in equal measure. This was Khazul the Undying, supreme commander of the Vorath Dominion, and he had come to personally oversee the destruction of this small and insignificant outpost. His voice boomed through the hub like thunder. You are prey, and this is the natural order of the universe. So do not weep for your lives, because they were never truly yours to keep. Mira was forced to her knees beside the Telvari child she had tried to comfort, and the little one gripped her hand so tightly that it hurt. The executioners raised their blades, and somewhere deep inside Mira Chen, in a place where 4 billion years of evolution had stored every lesson that Earth had ever taught its children, something ancient and terrible began to wake. The coalition soldiers had fought with everything they had, and it had not been enough. Mira had heard the stories during her journey through space, tales told by veteran travelers about the mighty Telvari warriors who could fight with 4 arms at once, and the brilliant Morthene tacticians who could see a battle unfold 10 moves ahead, and she had believed that the galaxy's defenders were invincible. Now she watched those same defenders die like insects beneath a crushing boot. The Vorath moved through the station's corridors with the confidence of apex predators who had never known fear. Their black chitin armor shrugged off plasma fire as they carved through defensive lines with blades that hummed with molecular edges sharp enough to split atoms. A Telvari sergeant named Korath made his last stand at the entrance to the medical bay, all 4 of his arms wielding weapons as he roared ancient war cries that his ancestors had shouted 10,000 years before. Ago, P killed 3 Vorath before a blade took his head, and his body fell beside the patients he had tried to protect. In the tactical center, a Morthene commander named Thessaly used her brilliant mind to coordinate the remaining defenders. moving them like pieces on a game board, as she searched desperately for some strategy that might turn the tide. But there was no strategy that could overcome such overwhelming force, and she knew it even as she kept trying. "Fall back to Corridor 7, she commanded through her communicator. "We can create a choke point and—" A Vorath fist punched through the wall beside her and grabbed her throat, and her tactical genius meant nothing as the life was squeezed from her body. The human soldiers fought too, these strange soft creatures from a distant world that most species still considered barely civilized, and they died alongside their alien comrades with the same courage and the same futility. Wong emptied his rifle into a charging Vorath and watched in horror as the creature barely slowed, and his last thought before the blade found him was of his mother's face and the garden she kept behind their house on Earth. Sergeant Maria Santos managed to kill 2 of the invaders with a combination of grenades and desperate hand-to-hand combat before she was overwhelmed, and she went down swinging even as the darkness took her. The battle lasted less than an hour. Commander Silas Vren was among the last to fall, standing in the central hub with a handful of survivors as wave after wave of Vorath crashed against their position like a black tide. He had fought in a dozen campaigns across 30 years of service, and he had never seen anything like this. Never faced an enemy so perfectly designed for destruction. A Vorath Dreadknight, one of the elite warriors who served as Khazul's personal guard, approached the commander with a blade that dripped with the blood of fallen soldiers. "You've fought well for prey," the Dreadknight said in a voice like grinding stones, "but fighting well and winning are not the same thing." Silas raised his weapon one final time, but his arms were heavy and his movements slow, and the blade slipped between his ribs before he could fire. He collapsed to the ground and watched through dimming eyes as the Vorath began gathering the civilians. From her place among the prisoners, Mira saw everything. She saw the bodies of soldiers who had given their lives to protect strangers, saw the blood that pooled on the floor and reflected the harsh emergency lighting, saw the faces of the dead frozen in expressions of defiance and fear and pain. She saw the Vorath move among the fallen like farmers walking through a harvested field, checking for survivors and finishing off any who still breathed. And she saw the refugees around her, thousands of beings from dozens of species, all of them kneeling and waiting to die. Some of them prayed in languages she did not understand, their voices rising in desperate pleas to gods who seemed very far away. Some of them wept silently, tears streaming down faces of every color and texture. Some of them held their children close and whispered words of comfort that no one believed. The Telvari child beside Mira had stopped trembling, and when Mira looked at him, she saw that his golden eyes had gone empty and distant, like he had already left his body behind. "What's your name?" Mira whispered, because she did not want him to die without someone knowing who he was. "Kel," he answered, in a voice so small she could barely hear it. "I'm Mira, and I want you to know that you're not alone, Kel." It was all she could offer him, just words and the warmth of her hand in his, but it was something. On his throne of bones, Khazul the Undying surveyed his conquest with the satisfaction of a predator who had eaten well. He was ancient by the standards of his kind, having lived for over 4 centuries, through a combination of genetic enhancement and the consumption of other species' life energies, and in all that time he had never tasted defeat. The Vorath were the perfect predators, engineered by evolution, and then further refined by their own scientists to be the ultimate killing machines, and the galaxy existed only to feed their hunger. "Begin the processing," Khazul commanded, his voice echoing through the hub like the pronouncement of a dark god. His executioners spread out among the prisoners, each one selecting a section of the crowd to harvest, and they moved with the casual efficiency of workers performing a routine task, because to them, That was all this was. They had done this 1,000 times on 1,000 worlds, and they would do it 1,000 times more, and the screams of the dying were just background noise to their ears. Executioner stopped in front of Mira and Kel, looking down at them with compound eyes that held no emotion and no mercy. Small ones, it observed, but meat is meat. It raised its blade, and the molecular edge caught the light and gleamed with deadly promise. Mira stared at that blade and felt time slow to a crawl as her mind raced through possibilities and found none. She thought of her father, somewhere far away, who would never know what happened to his daughter. She thought of her mother, dead these past 3 years from a sickness that Earth's doctors could not cure. She thought of home, of blue skies and green grass and the smell of rain on hot pavement. And then she thought of Kel, this child who was not even human, but who was just as scared and just as deserving of life as anyone else. Something stirred in the depths of Mira's being, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. It was not courage, not exactly, because courage implies a choice, and this was more like instinct. It was the thing that had kept humanity alive through ice ages and famines and predators and plagues, the thing that had driven her ancestors to pick up rocks and sticks and fight back against a world that wanted them dead. It was the refusal to accept extinction. The blade began its downward arc, and Mira Chen stood up. She did not know why she stood up, because her mind was not in control anymore. Her body moved on its own, rising from the floor in a single fluid motion that surprised even her, and her hand shot out and caught the falling blade before it could touch young Kel. The executioner froze in absolute confusion, because nothing like this had ever happened before. In 400 years of conquest, no prey had ever stood up, no victim had ever reached out to grab a weapon meant to kill them. No soft and helpless creature had ever dared to defy the natural order. But Mira Chen was not just any creature. She was human, and humans came from Earth, and Earth was a world that had spent 4 billion years trying to kill everything that lived on it. Her fingers wrapped around the blade, and she felt the molecular edge slice into her palm, but the pain was distant and unimportant, because something much older than pain was flowing through her veins now. Executioner tried to pull the weapon back, but Mira held on with a grip that would not break, a grip that her ancestors had developed for holding onto branches as they swung through ancient forests, a grip refined over millions of years for one simple purpose: to never let go. "What are you doing?" the executioner demanded, genuine confusion in its clicking voice. Mira did not answer, because she had no words for what was happening inside her. Instead, she twisted her body and pulled, using the executioner's own strength against it, and the blade came free in her bloody hand as the creature stumbled forward off balance. Her other hand came up and drove the blade into the gap between the executioner's head and body, finding the soft tissue beneath the chitin armor with an accuracy that seemed impossible. The Vorath fell dead at her feet. For a moment, the entire central hub went silent, as every eye turned toward the small human girl standing over the body of a fallen executioner, with blood dripping from her hand and a stolen blade gleaming in her grip. Kazul rose from his throne, his compound eyes narrowing as he observed this impossible sight. "What is this?" he demanded. Mira turned to face him, and something had changed in her brown eyes, something that made even the ancient warlord pause. She was still small, still young, still soft and fragile by Vorath standards. But there was a fire burning behind those eyes now, a fire that had burned in human hearts since the first of her kind had stood up on 2 legs and looked at a world full of predators and decided to become one themselves. "I am not prey," Mira said, and her voice carried through the hub with a clarity that surprised everyone, including herself. "All things are prey to the Vorath," Kazul replied, but there was something new in his tone, something that might have been curiosity. Mira took a step forward, and the Vorath executioners around her stepped back. They did not understand why they stepped back, because they had never retreated from anything in their lives. But something about this small creature made their instincts scream warnings that their minds could not comprehend. "You have conquered species who built great civilizations," Mira said as she took another step. "You have destroyed peoples who lived in peace for thousands of years. And you have never lost because you have never faced anything like us." "Like you?" Kazul laughed, a harsh clicking sound that echoed off the walls. "You are small and soft and weak, just another species to be harvested." "We are from Earth," Mira answered, and her voice grew stronger with each word. "A world where the ground shakes and opens to swallow cities. A world where the water rises up in waves taller than mountains. A world where the sky itself catches fire and burns everything below." She took another step forward. Another executioner fell back before her. "We survived ice ages that covered half our world in frozen death, and we survived plagues that killed millions of us in months. And we survived predators with teeth and claws and poison that should have wiped us out 1,000 times over." The refugees were watching now, not with fear, but with something else. Something like wonder. "Every generation of humans, who ever lived, faced extinction," Mira continued, her voice rising like a tide. "And every generation refused to die. And that refusal is in my blood and my bones and every cell of my body." She raised the blade and pointed it at Kazul. "You think you are predators, but you have never hunted anything that could hunt you back. And you have never faced prey that refused to be prey. And you have never understood what it means to fight, not because you can win, but because you cannot accept losing." Around the hub, something was changing. Refugees were looking at their hands. Four-fingered hands that had once wielded weapons in defense of their homeworld, before the Vorath had broken them. The Morthine were calculating, their brilliant minds running through scenarios and finding new possibilities in this impossible moment. Even the smallest and weakest of the captive species were stirring, watching this human girl who had done what none of them had dared to do. She had stood up. A Vorath dreadnought moved toward Mira, its blade raised high, and she did not flinch or retreat. Instead, she moved toward it, and their blades met in a clash of molecular edges that sent sparks flying through the air. The dreadnought was bigger and stronger and faster, a warrior trained from birth in the art of killing. But Mira fought with something it had never encountered before. She fought like prey. She dodged instead of blocking, slicked sideways instead of standing firm, used the dreadnought's own edge. Momentum to create openings that she exploited with quick, precise strikes. The Vorath were predators, and predators had no need for defense, because they had never been attacked, and they struck with all their power in every blow, because overwhelming force had always been enough. But Mira's ancestors had spent millions of years learning to fight things bigger and stronger than themselves, learning to use speed and cunning and endurance instead of brute strength, learning that survival meant never fighting fair. She opened a cut on the dreadnought's arm, then another on its leg, then a third across its chest, each wound small but bleeding. The dreadnought roared in fury and swung wildly, and Mira ducked under the blow and drove her blade up through the warrior's jaw and into its brain. 2 Vorath dead. Mira stood over the fallen dreadnought, breathing hard, blood flowing from cuts on her arms and her side. And she looked at Kazul with eyes that held no fear. She said it again. "Because we have been fighting for our survival since before your species existed, and we are very good at it." Kazul stared at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his ancient eyes. For the first time in 400 years, he was uncertain. The Vorath had ruled the stars for 4 centuries, because they understood one simple truth about the universe. The strong devour the weak, and that is the way of all things. They had built their entire civilization on this foundation, breeding themselves for size and strength and aggression, conquering world after world because no species had ever been able to stand against them. But they had never encountered humanity before, and humanity did not play by the same rules. Mira moved through the central hub like a force of nature, and the Vorath who tried to stop her learned too late that they were facing something their evolution had not prepared them for. A warrior lunged at her from the left, and she dropped low and rolled beneath its strike, coming up behind it and hamstringing it with a quick slash before moving on. Another came from the right, and she used a fallen body as a springboard, launching herself over its head and opening its throat as she moved past it. A third tried to grab her, and she twisted in its grip like water flowing through fingers, turning the grab into a throw that sent the warrior crashing into two of its companions. The Vorath fought with overwhelming power, each blow strong enough to shatter stone, but their power meant nothing when they could not land a hit. And Mira was everywhere and nowhere, a blur of motion and blood and desperate survival instinct. "Kill her," Khazul bellowed from his throne. "She is one human girl. Just kill her." But his warriors were struggling to obey because they had never learned to fight like this. The Vorath were apex predators, the top of every food chain on every world they had conquered, and apex predators did not need to be cunning or careful or defensive. They just needed to be strong. Humans were different. Humans had evolved on a world where they were not the top of the food chain, where lions and tigers and bears had all seen them as potential meals, where survival meant learning to think and plan and work together. Humans had invented weapons because their claws were too short and their teeth were too dull, and they had invented traps because they could not always win in a straight fight, and they had invented persistence hunting because they could not run as fast as their prey, but they could run longer. 4 million years of evolution had turned humanity into the most dangerous kind of predator, the kind that did not rely on strength alone. And all of that evolution lived in Mira's bones. She did not think about what she was doing, because thinking would have gotten her killed. She just moved and reacted and let her body do what it had been designed to do. A blade came at her head, and she leaned away just enough for it to miss. Claws swiped at her chest, and she turned sideways to present a smaller target. A warrior tried to crush her with its bulk aside and let its momentum carry it past her before planting her blade in its back. The refugees watched in stunned silence as this small human girl did the impossible over and over again. A Telvari elder with a long memory suddenly gasped as understanding struck him. "Deathworlders," he whispered, his voice filled with awe and terror. "The humans are from a death world." A death world was a planet so hostile to life that any species that evolved there had to become incredibly tough and adaptable just to survive. Most intelligent species came from gentle worlds with stable climates and abundant resources, worlds that allowed civilization to develop without constant struggle. But Earth was different. Earth was a world of earthquakes and volcanoes and hurricanes and tornadoes, a world of droughts and floods and ice ages, a world where nearly every living thing was either trying to eat you, or poison you, or infect you. Any species that survived on Earth long enough to develop intelligence had to be extraordinarily resilient, and humanity had not just survived on Earth, they had thrived. They had conquered every environment on their planet, from frozen tundras to burning deserts to the depths of their oceans. They had done this not through strength but through stubbornness, through the absolute refusal to give up, even when giving up was the only sensible option. Mira was bleeding from a dozen wounds now, her stolen blade chipped and dull from constant use, her muscles burning with exhaustion. But she kept fighting because stopping meant dying, and dying meant failing, and failing was not something humans were designed to accept. Another Vorath fell, and another, and another. The floor of the central hub was covered with bodies now, black chitin armor mixed with the red blood of the executioners. And the survivors among the Vorath were beginning to feel something they had never felt before: fear. They did not have a word for it in their language because they had never needed one, but they recognized the sensation, the cold tightness in their chests, the urge to run away from something that threatened them. It was a new and terrible experience. Khazul watched his warriors die, and the uncertainty in his ancient eyes slowly transformed into something else, something that might have been rage or might have been respect. "Enough!" he roared, and his voice shook the walls of the hub. He rose from his throne, all 8 feet of black chitin and coiled muscle, and he began to walk down the steps toward the killing floor. The remaining Vorath warriors parted before him like waves before a ship, and even Mira paused in her bloody work to watch the Supreme Commander approach. He was bigger than any of his warriors, his armor thicker and darker, his blades longer and sharper, and the power that radiated from him was palpable. This was the being who had conquered 1,000 worlds, who had exterminated hundreds of species, who had ruled the Vorath dominion for 4 centuries without ever facing a serious challenge. And he was coming for her. "You have killed 40 of my warriors," Khazul said as he approached, his voice calm now and filled with something like curiosity. "No single being has ever killed so many Vorath." Mira faced him, her chest heaving, her blade held ready, her body screaming for rest that she could not give it. "Your warriors were not prepared for what I am," she replied. "And what are you, little human?" Mira smiled, though it was more a baring of teeth than a sign of happiness. "I am the daughter of a world that never stopped trying to kill us, and we never stopped fighting back. And that is why you are going to lose." Khazul laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I have not lost a battle in 400 years, child, and I will not lose to you." He raised his blades, and they gleamed with an edge that made Mira's stolen weapon look like a dull stick. "But I will honor you with my personal attention, because you have earned that much at least." Khazul struck first, his twin blades slicing through the air faster than thought. And Mira barely managed to throw herself backward before they carved through the space where she had been standing. He was faster than his warriors, much faster, and stronger too. And the ancient warlord moved with a grace that belied his massive size. His second strike came before she had finished recovering from the first, and she felt the blade kiss her shoulder and leave a line of fire across her skin. "You are remarkable," Khazul admitted as he pressed his attack, "but remarkable is not enough to defeat me." Mira dodged and weaved, her body moving on pure instinct, but she could feel herself slowing down, could feel the exhaustion and blood loss catching up with her. She had fought so hard to get here, had killed so many just to reach this moment, and now she was facing an enemy that outclassed her in every physical way. If this had been a fair fight, she would already be dead. But humans had never believed in fair fights. Mira let Khazul's next strike come closer than she needed to, deliberately stumbling as if her legs were giving out, and the Supreme Commander took the bait. He lunged forward for the killing blow, committing all his weight to a strike that would split her in two. And Mira was not where he expected her to be. She had dropped low at the last instant, letting his blade pass over her head, and she drove her own weapon up into the gap where his arm met his body. Khazul roared in pain and backhanded her across the hub, sending her flying through the air to crash into a pile of broken equipment. Mira lay there for a moment, her vision blurring, her ribs screaming in protest, and she wondered if this was where she would die. Then she thought of Kel, the Telvari child who had held her hand and trembled with fear. She thought of all the refugees watching this battle, hoping against hope that somehow This human girl could do the impossible. She thought of her father, who would never know what happened to his daughter if she failed here. And she thought of Earth, of all the generations who had come before her, who had faced impossible odds and refused to surrender. Mira stood up. Kazul stared at her with something that might have been disbelief. "Your arm is broken," he observed, noting the way her left limb hung limp at her side. "I have another one," Mira replied. "You are bleeding from wounds that would kill most species." "I have been bleeding my whole life one way or another." Kazul shook his head slowly. "Why do you not surrender? You cannot win this fight. You must know that." Mira smiled, and there was something in that smile that made the ancient warlord pause. "Because I am human," she answered, "and humans do not know how to give up." She charged him. It was suicide. Everyone watching knew it was suicide. A small wounded girl charging the greatest warrior the Vorath had ever produced. But Mira did not care about the odds because her ancestors had never cared about the odds. They had fought ice ages with nothing but fire and furs. They had crossed oceans in boats made of wood and faith. They had climbed mountains and explored deserts and walked on the surface of their moon because someone had dared them to do it. Humanity had never looked at the impossible and decided to quit. Kazul met her charge with a strike that should have ended everything, but Mira twisted at the last second, and the blade that was meant for her heart took her in the side instead, grabbed his arm with her one good hand, and held on with the grip of a species that had evolved to never let go. "What are you doing?" Kazul demanded, trying to shake her off. "Holding on," Mira gasped through the pain. "It is what we do." She pulled herself up his arm, climbing his body like a mountain, and he struck at her with his free blade, but she was too close for him to get a clean angle. Her teeth found the gap between his armor plates, and she bit down with jaws that her ancestors had used to crack bones for marrow when food was scarce. Kazul howled and tried to crush her against his chest, but she wriggled free and scrambled up to his shoulders. He reached up to grab her, but she was already moving, sliding around to his back, where his arms could not easily reach. "Get off me!" the Supreme Commander roared, spinning and thrashing, but Mira held on with fingers that would not release, even if she wanted them to. Blades somewhere in the chaos. But it did not matter, because she had another weapon. The oldest weapon humanity had ever used. Her determination. She wrapped her good arm around his throat and squeezed with every ounce of strength she had left. Kazul's armor protected most of his body, but his throat was still flesh beneath the chitin, and flesh could be crushed. He clawed at her, raking wounds across her back and legs, but she did not let go. He threw himself against walls and pillars, trying to dislodge her, but she did not let go. He roared and cursed and threatened, but she did not let go, because letting go meant dying, and dying meant failing, and Mira Chen had already decided that she was not going to fail. The seconds stretched into an eternity as the two of them struggled, the ancient warlord and the teenage girl, and the watching crowd held their breath. Kazul's movements grew slower, weaker, as his brain began to starve for oxygen. "How?" he managed to gasp, his voice barely a whisper now. "We survived Earth," Mira answered, her own voice fading. "Everything else is just practice." The Supreme Commander of the Vorath Dominion fell to his knees, then forward onto his face, and he did not rise again. Mira lay on his back, unable to move, barely able to breathe, and she watched through dimming eyes as the remaining Voraths stared at their fallen leader. Then they ran. Not retreated, not withdrew in good order, but ran, fleeing the central hub in the station and the impossible human girl who had done what no one else had ever done. They ran because they had finally learned what fear felt like. The refugees surged forward, alien hands reaching out to lift Mira from the body of her enemy, and she heard voices speaking in languages she did not understand, but the tone was the same in all of them. Gratitude and awe and something like worship. And she realized it was Kel, the Telvari child, his golden eyes streaming with tears as he held her bloody hand. "You did it," he whispered. "You saved us." Mira tried to answer, but the darkness was closing in, and the last thing she felt, before losing consciousness, was the warmth of hands holding her up. Hands of a dozen different species, united in their care for the small human girl who had refused to die. When she woke 3 days later in a Coalition medical bay, she learned that her story had already spread across the galaxy. The Vorath, undefeated for 400 years, broken by a single human child. Species who had dismissed Earth as a primitive backwater were suddenly paying attention to humanity, seeing them with new eyes, wondering what else these soft and stubborn creatures might be capable of. And on Earth, billions of humans went about their daily lives, unaware that one of their children had just announced their arrival on the galactic stage. Stage in the most dramatic way possible. Commander Silas Wren, recovered from his wounds, came to visit her in the medical bay. "What are you people?" he asked, the same question that everyone was asking now. Mira looked at him with tired eyes and a faint smile. "We are the ones who never learned to quit," she answered. "And I think the galaxy is going to have to get used to that." Outside the window, the stars glittered with infinite possibilities, and somewhere among them, the Vorath were learning that the universe had just become a much more dangerous place, because humanity had arrived, and they were not going anywhere.